The phenomenon of spiritual awakening is often accompanied by a profound dissolution of the persona, the mask by which the individual presents themselves to the outer world. This persona is not merely a superficial facade, but rather a complex construct fashioned through years of social conditioning, cultural expectations, and personal desires to conform to the collective norms of society. It acts as a necessary interface between the inner self and the external environment, facilitating communication, acceptance, and social belonging. However, it is also inherently limiting and deceptive, as it obscures the true depths of the psyche beneath a veneer of roles and identities. When spiritual awakening occurs, this carefully constructed persona begins to crumble, revealing the vast emptiness that lies behind it and causing a seismic shift in the individual's motivation and sense of purpose. The persona functions as a protective shield that allows the ego to navigate the demands of social life. It is an adaptive mechanism designed to help the individual fit into the world by adopting roles that are valued and recognized by others. These roles might include being a professional, a parent, a friend, or any number of identities that confer a sense of order and predictability. The ego invests heavily in these roles because they provide a sense of stability and control, offering a framework through which the individual understands themselves and their place in the world. Motivation is thus closely tied to the maintenance and enhancement of this persona. Goals are pursued, achievements sought, and ambitions nurtured, all to uphold the image one wishes to project outwardly. The success of the persona fuels motivation because it brings approval, status, and validation from the external world. Yet the persona is essentially a compromise, a half-truth that obscures the authentic self. Beneath it lies the unconscious, a vast reservoir of suppressed desires, fears, and potentials that remain unacknowledged. The spiritual awakening functions as a catalyst that dissolves the boundaries between the conscious and unconscious realms, compelling the individual to confront what lies beneath the mask. This confrontation is often unsettling, as the persona's security is stripped away, leaving the ego exposed and vulnerable. The social roles and identities that once gave life direction and energy now appear empty or meaningless. The individual experiences a disorienting loss of motivation, as the external goals tethered to the persona no longer resonate with their emerging inner reality. This loss of motivation after spiritual awakening is not a mere absence of drive, but a profound existential crisis that arises when the ego's foundations are undermined. The person who once found purpose in external achievements, material success, or social approval suddenly feels hollow and disconnected. This is because the spiritual awakening reveals the persona to be a mask that hides the fractured and fragmented nature of the ego itself. The ego's investments in external validation become apparent as illusions, and the previous sources of motivation dissolve in the light of a deeper inner truth. The individual faces a void where the persona used to be, and this void must be endured before a new sense of self can emerge. The collapse of the persona is akin to the falling away of old skins that no longer fit. Yet this process is fraught with danger and confusion. Without the guiding framework of the persona, the individual may feel adrift in a sea of uncertainty, unable to find direction or meaning. This stage can manifest as apathy, depression, or a profound existential malaise. However, this is not an end, but a transitional phase in the larger process of individuation, the integration of the conscious and unconscious aspects of the self. The disintegration of the persona creates the necessary space for the psyche to reorganize around a more authentic center, one that embraces complexity and contradiction rather than denying them. In the aftermath of the persona's collapse, the individual begins to experience the raw and often unsettling contents of the unconscious. The suppression of unwanted or feared aspects of the self during the formation of the persona means that these elements are now flooding into consciousness. This influx can be overwhelming, as it confronts the person with shadow aspects, parts of the psyche that have been rejected, disowned, or denied. The motivation once directed outward towards societal goals must now be redirected inward to face these hidden dimensions of the self. This inner confrontation requires courage and honesty, as it challenges the individual to accept and integrate aspects of themselves that contradict their previous self-image. The loss of motivation is therefore a necessary stage in spiritual awakening, signaling that the individual is moving beyond the superficial attachments of the persona toward a deeper engagement with the totality of the psyche. It reflects a moment of profound rupture in the continuity of the ego's narrative, opening a space for transformation and growth. In this sense, the collapse of the persona is not a failure but a vital step toward wholeness. It demands that the individual relinquish old identities and false securities, allowing the authentic self to emerge from the shadows of unconscious material. This process is not easily accomplished, as the persona often resists dissolution. It is supported by the expectations of society, family, and culture, which impose strong pressures to maintain appearances and conform to accepted norms. The individual must navigate these external demands while simultaneously confronting the internal dissolution of their accustomed identity. This tension creates a state of liminality, where the person exists between worlds, no longer anchored in the familiar roles of the past, but not yet fully embodied in a new sense of self. The loss of motivation during this liminal phase reflects the absence of clear goals or direction, as the psyche undergoes a profound restructuring. Yet within this liminal space lies the potential for renewal. The collapse of the persona strips away the illusions that have obscured the true nature of the self and the world. It exposes the individual to a more fundamental reality, one that is not mediated by social roles or external validation, but arises from an inner depth and authenticity. This encounter with the self is both terrifying and liberating, as it demands the courage to face the unknown and the willingness to embrace uncertainty. The spiritual awakening thus transforms motivation from a drive for external achievement into a quest for inner meaning. The dissolution of the persona frees psychic energy that was previously invested in maintaining social roles, releasing it to fuel the exploration of the unconscious and the integration of shadow aspects. This reorientation of motivation is subtle and often misunderstood. It appears as a loss or absence, but is, in truth, a profound shift in the nature of desire and purpose. The individual moves from seeking validation in the outer world to seeking wholeness within. This internal journey is not linear or straightforward. It involves recurring cycles of disintegration and reintegration, where fragments of the persona and unconscious material interact in complex ways. The loss of motivation may return at various points, signaling moments when the ego must relinquish old attachments and prepare for new stages of growth. Each cycle deepens the individual's understanding of themselves and expands their capacity for authenticity and compassion. The collapse of the persona also reveals the paradoxical nature of motivation in the spiritual context. True motivation cannot be imposed from without or derived solely from rational goals. It arises spontaneously from the alignment of the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche, from the unfolding of the self in its totality. This spontaneous motivation is often quiet and subtle, emerging as a deep inner calling rather than an external ambition. It is a motivation rooted in meaning rather than success, in being rather than doing. Thus, the loss of motivation after spiritual awakening can be seen as a profound existential recalibration. It signals the passing of the old self and the emergence of a new way of being. The individual is invited to let go of the illusory goals of the persona and to enter into a relationship with the depths of their own psyche. This journey demands patience, self-compassion, and the willingness to dwell in uncertainty. It is a passage through darkness toward the light of self-realization and integration. In this way, the collapse of the persona is not simply a loss, but a gateway. It opens the door to the possibility of living a life that is not dictated by social expectations, but guided by the authentic voice of the self. The temporary absence of motivation is a necessary silence before the awakening of a more profound and enduring purpose. It is an invitation to surrender to the mysteries of the psyche and to embrace the transformational power of spiritual awakening. When the veil of spiritual awakening is lifted, the individual is thrust into a confrontation with the ego, a structure once perceived as the center of identity and personal drive. The ego, which had long been the engine behind ambition, desire, and motivation, is suddenly revealed in its true light, a fragile construct composed largely of illusions and projections. This confrontation shakes the foundation of what was believed to be the self, exposing the ego's limitations and the futility of its incessant striving. The ego, once sustained by its attachments to identity, control, and achievement, loses its usual impetus and becomes drained of its vitality, resulting in a profound inner stillness that can be mistaken for a loss of motivation or even despair. The ego's fundamental role is to create a coherent narrative about who we are, organizing our experiences into a stable sense of self that can navigate the external world. It constructs boundaries that separate the individual from the chaos of the unconscious and the world beyond. In this way, the ego acts as a necessary agent of order and meaning. However, the ego's story is never absolute truth, but rather a symbolic representation crafted to maintain psychological stability and social functionality. It depends heavily on identification with certain roles, beliefs, and goals. Motivation arises from this identification because the ego sees itself as a separate and autonomous entity with needs to fulfill and challenges to overcome. Spiritual awakening disrupts this narrative. By exposing the ego's constructed nature, it reveals that what was assumed to be the I is not a fixed essence, but a shifting assemblage of thoughts, emotions, and conditioned patterns. The individual begins to see through the ego's claims to independence and control, recognizing it instead as a mechanism vulnerable to fear, insecurity, and illusion. This insight diminishes the ego's hold on motivation because the goals that once appeared meaningful are now perceived as transient or ultimately empty. The ego's usual strategies, striving for success, recognition, or possession, lose their compelling force as their underlying assumptions are questioned. This deconstruction of the ego's illusions is a painful and disorienting experience. It can feel like a dissolution of identity. As the structures that supported motivation crumble, the person may find themselves in a state of existential pause, where the familiar ambitions and desires no longer provide direction. What once energized the will is replaced by a sense of void, a psychic quietude, where the incessant chatter of ego-driven motivation subsides. This state can be misinterpreted as apathy or depression, yet it is, in truth, a moment of profound transformation. The stillness that follows the collapse of egoic motivation is not an absence of life, but a different mode of existence. It is a withdrawal from the external world's demands and an invitation to turn inward. In this silence, the individual may encounter a deeper dimension of the psyche that had been overshadowed by egoic activity. This inner realm is vast, mysterious, and often unsettling, as it contains both light and shadow aspects of the self. The energy that once propelled external achievement is now redirected toward inner exploration and integration. Motivation in this new state is subtle and intrinsic, arising not from the ego's desire for control or success, but from a deeper yearning for wholeness and authenticity. The ego's usual drive is replaced by a more fluid and dynamic movement of the psyche toward balance and harmony. This process requires patience and surrender, as it unfolds beyond the linear cause and effect logic of ordinary ambition. The individual learns to trust the unfolding of the inner journey, even when the path is uncertain and the old motivations are no longer accessible. This encounter with the ego's emptiness also opens the possibility of transcending its limitations. The realization that the ego is an illusion is not a nihilistic end, but a doorway to a more expansive identity. Beyond the ego lies the self, a greater wholeness that embraces contradictions and integrates the conscious and unconscious realms. The loss of ego-driven motivation is thus a necessary stage before the emergence of motivation aligned with the self's deeper purpose. This higher motivation is not forced or calculated, but spontaneous and inspired by the inner voice of authenticity. The transition from egoic to self-motivated existence is often turbulent. The individual must navigate the tension between old habits of striving and new impulses toward inner growth. The ego resists losing its control, and the unconscious challenges the person with shadow material that demands acknowledgement and integration. In this crucible of transformation, motivation may fluctuate dramatically, at times returning in bursts of clarity and at others dissolving into stillness. Each oscillation brings the individual closer to a more integrated and resilient self. Moreover, the confrontation with the ego's emptiness reveals the paradoxical nature of motivation. The ego's drive is often rooted in a sense of lack and fragmentation, pushing the individual outward in search of fulfillment. The deeper motivation awakened through spiritual insight, however, arises from a sense of abundance and unity. It is a motivation to embody wholeness rather than to compensate for deficiency. This shift marks a profound reorientation of the psyche, where purpose is no longer defined by external validation but by alignment with the inner truth. In this way, the loss of motivation after spiritual awakening is not a sign of failure or weakness, but an essential phase in psychological and spiritual development. It signals that the individual is moving beyond the limitations of egoic identity and entering a new relationship with the self. The stillness and emptiness encountered in this phase prepare the ground for a more authentic and enduring form of motivation, one that is rooted in the depths of being rather than the fleeting rewards of the outer world. Thus, the withdrawal of motivation following spiritual awakening can be understood as a profound recalibration of the psyche. It is a necessary shedding of illusions and attachments that allows for the emergence of a new self that is both more vulnerable and more whole. This process requires courage, surrender, and patience as the individual learns to navigate the liminal space between ego dissolution and self-realization. In embracing this inner void, the person opens the way for a transformation that transcends ordinary ambition and leads to a life imbued with deeper meaning and purpose. After the experience of spiritual awakening, a remarkable shift occurs within the psyche, where the flow of psychic energy, once primarily directed outward toward tangible achievements and external validation, begins to turn inward. This reorientation signifies a withdrawal from the external world and a movement into the inner depths of the self. The energy that formerly fueled ambitions, goals, and social engagements is redirected toward the exploration and integration of the inner world. This inward turn is not merely a passive retreat, but an essential and active process in the transformation of the individual. It reflects a necessary regression in the psychological sense, a stepping back from the distractions of outer life to confront the complexities and hidden dimensions of the unconscious. The libido, understood here as the fundamental psychic energy, is a vital force that animates both conscious activity and unconscious processes. Before spiritual awakening, this energy is largely invested in outward pursuits, career success, relationships, status, material accumulation, and various personal ambitions. These activities provide clear markers of progress and purpose, structuring daily life and fueling motivation. However, when spiritual awakening unfolds, the meaning of these pursuits is called into question, and their hold on the individual's attention loosens. The psyche recognizes that true fulfillment does not reside in external accomplishments but in the deeper realization of the self. This shift toward the inner world involves a turning away from external validation and toward self-examination. The individual begins to notice the multiplicity of voices and images within, including those aspects that were previously ignored or suppressed. Dreams, fantasies, intuitive insights, and spontaneous emotions gain prominence, offering a language through which the unconscious communicates. The withdrawal of psychic energy from the outside world creates the conditions for these inner phenomena to surface and be encountered with conscious awareness. In this process, motivation for outward action diminishes, often drastically, because the familiar sources of motivation tied to societal roles and expectations no longer provide satisfaction or meaning. The psyche's attention is absorbed by the task of psychic integration, a complex and demanding endeavor that requires time, reflection, and a willingness to face inner conflicts. The outer world may seem less urgent or compelling, as the individual prioritizes this inward journey. Social engagements, career ambitions, and material pursuits lose their allure, replaced by a fascination with the mysteries of the self. This inward turn is a natural and necessary part of spiritual transformation. It corresponds to a regressive movement, not in the sense of a retreat into infantile dependency, but as a deliberate psychological step back that allows for renewal. By withdrawing libido from the external world, the individual creates space for the unconscious to reveal itself more fully. This process is essential for the integration of shadow aspects, those parts of the self that have been denied or repressed. The energy previously devoted to maintaining the persona and meeting external demands is now available to engage with the hidden contents of the psyche. The withdrawal into the inner world also highlights the paradoxical nature of motivation after spiritual awakening. What appears as a loss of drive in the external sense is actually a transformation of motivation at a deeper level. The inner work demands a different kind of energy, one that is reflective, patient, and receptive. This subtle form of motivation may not manifest as outward activity or achievement, but it is no less vital. It is the motivation to understand oneself, to heal, and to achieve psychic wholeness. This form of motivation is often invisible to others and can be misunderstood by the individual as stagnation or failure. The process of turning inward can be accompanied by feelings of isolation and loneliness, as the individual's priorities diverge from those of their social environment. Friends, family, and colleagues may not recognize or appreciate the inner changes taking place, leading to a sense of separation. This social withdrawal is another aspect of the regression, reflecting the necessity of solitude for inner work. The individual learns to find companionship within the self, cultivating an inner dialogue that supports exploration and healing. Within this inner realm, the psyche begins to organize itself differently. Patterns that once governed behavior and motivation are loosened, making room for new possibilities to emerge. The integration of unconscious material leads to a gradual reconstruction of identity, one that is less dependent on external validation and more grounded in inner authenticity. This process is not linear and can be marked by periods of confusion, doubt, and resistance. However, it is ultimately directed toward a more balanced and harmonious relationship between the conscious and unconscious aspects of the self. The withdrawal of libido into the inner world also aligns with archetypal themes found in myths and spiritual traditions. The hero's journey, for example, often involves a descent into darkness, or the underworld, symbolizing the confrontation with unconscious contents. This descent is necessary for transformation and rebirth. Similarly, the individual's psychic withdrawal can be seen as a symbolic journey inward, where the raw materials for growth and individuation are gathered. The energy redirected inward becomes the source for new forms of creativity, insight, and spiritual development. This inward focus can also bring about a redefinition of what constitutes meaningful motivation. The goals and desires that once seemed paramount are re-evaluated in light of deeper values and insights. The individual may come to prioritize qualities such as authenticity, compassion, wisdom, and presence over traditional measures of success. Motivation becomes less about achieving external milestones and more about embodying a way of being that reflects the integrated self. This shift in motivation is subtle but profound, representing a maturation of the psyche. The natural ebb and flow of psychic energy means that periods of intense inward focus may alternate with times when external motivation returns in new forms. The spiritual awakening process does not permanently sever the individual from the world, but transforms the relationship with it. Outward activity may resume, but it is now informed by the insights and integration achieved through the inward journey. The withdrawal of libido is thus a temporary but essential phase that prepares the ground for renewed engagement with life, from a place of greater wholeness. The inward turn after spiritual awakening is a profound expression of the psyche's self-regulating nature. It illustrates how motivation is not a fixed or static force, but a dynamic process that responds to inner states and needs. The apparent loss of motivation is part of a larger process of transformation, where the energy of the psyche is conserved and redirected toward growth. This inward movement is vital for healing fragmentation and facilitating the emergence of a more authentic self. In embracing this withdrawal into the inner world, the individual participates in a timeless and universal process of transformation. It is a return to the source from which all motivation flows, a source that transcends egoic desires and attachments. The energy conserved in this retreat nourishes the roots of the psyche, allowing it to deepen and expand. Through this inward turn, motivation is not lost, but reborn, transformed into a higher expression aligned with the unfolding of the self. The experience of losing motivation after a spiritual awakening can be understood through the metaphor of death and rebirth, a symbolic process deeply embedded in the psyche's journey toward wholeness. This loss is not a simple disappearance of drive or purpose, but rather a profound psychological transformation in which the old self must die to make way for a new and more authentic self to emerge. The no-motivation state marks a liminal threshold, a dark and often confusing passage where the former identity disintegrates, leaving a void that must be endured before renewal can occur. This process can be likened to the alchemical stage known as nigredo, a blackening or decomposition, where the psyche undergoes a necessary purification through dissolution. The old self is constructed through layers of identification, habits, beliefs, and attachments that have shaped the individual's sense of identity and motivation. These elements form the ego's narrative, which provides coherence and direction. When spiritual awakening unfolds, this narrative is disrupted, and the ego's foundations are shaken. The roles, goals, and ambitions that once fueled motivation lose their meaning as the individual perceives the illusory nature of these attachments. The death of the old self is not merely a loss, but a necessary unmaking, a breaking down of the psychological structures that no longer serve the person's evolving consciousness. This dissolution is painful and disorienting because it involves confronting the void left by the absence of familiar motivations and identities. The individual may feel adrift, disconnected from former sources of energy and purpose. There is a sense of emptiness and sometimes despair, as the old ways of being no longer hold. Yet this void is not simply a negative space. It is a fertile ground for transformation. It represents the clearing away of old psychic debris to prepare for the emergence of new life and meaning. The alchemical metaphor of Negredo captures the essence of this phase, a dark night of the soul where the psyche is immersed in chaos and uncertainty. This stage is essential for purification, as it strips away illusions, confronts shadow aspects, and breaks down the rigidity of the persona. Only through this death can the psyche be reborn in a state of greater integration and authenticity. The death of motivation at this stage is thus an indication that the individual is undergoing a profound inner transformation, even if it feels like loss or stagnation. The liminal space between death and rebirth is marked by ambiguity and paradox. The individual is neither the old self nor the new, existing in a threshold state where previous certainties dissolve, but new ones have not yet crystallized. This in-between phase can last for varying durations depending on the person's readiness, willingness to face inner darkness, and the support available for psychological integration. During this time, motivation may be virtually non-existent, as the psyche is in a state of suspension, neither fully engaged with external life, nor fully immersed in inner renewal. Yet this suspension is crucial. It allows the psyche to loosen attachments to outdated patterns, and opens the possibility for new structures to form. The death of the old self's motivation creates a psychic vacuum that invites transformation. The individual begins to shed limiting beliefs, habitual behaviors, and unconscious complexes that have constrained growth. This purgative process clears the way for a reconstitution of identity that is more aligned with the authentic self, rather than the ego's constructed persona. As the rebirth phase approaches, motivation begins to re-emerge, but it is transformed. It no longer derives from external validation or conditioned desires, but arises organically from the integrated self. This renewed motivation is characterized by a deeper sense of purpose that is in harmony with the individual's inner truth and the broader unfolding of their life. It is less about achieving goals in a conventional sense, and more about embodying values, living authentically, and participating in the process of ongoing self-realization. This rebirth is often symbolized by archetypal imagery of resurrection, awakening, or illumination. The individual experiences a newfound vitality, clarity, and commitment to a path that honors both the conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. Motivation is now infused with a spiritual quality, reflecting a connection to something greater than the ego's limited concerns. This connection fosters resilience and perseverance, as the person is driven by an inner calling rather than external pressures. The process of death and rebirth in motivation is cyclical and may recur at various stages of spiritual development. Each cycle deepens the individual's understanding of themselves and expands their capacity for wholeness. The initial loss of motivation after awakening is thus the first step in a series of transformations that ultimately lead to a more integrated and authentic life. This cyclical nature reflects the dynamic and evolving nature of the psyche, always moving toward greater complexity and unity. This understanding challenges the common perception that loss of motivation is simply a problem to be fixed or overcome quickly. Instead, it invites patience and compassion for oneself during this difficult phase. It encourages recognizing the necessity of allowing the old self to die fully before rushing into renewed activity or goal pursuit. The death of motivation is not a failure but a sacred passage, a necessary surrender that precedes true growth. In this light, the emptiness and stillness experienced after spiritual awakening are gifts rather than curses. They provide the conditions for deep inner work, reflection, and healing. They reveal the profound nature of psychological transformation, which cannot be hurried or avoided. Through this process, the individual gains access to a richer and more authentic source of motivation, one that arises from the depths of the soul rather than the superficialities of the ego. Ultimately, the loss of motivation after spiritual awakening is a profound invitation to enter the mystery of the self. It calls for courage to face the darkness, trust in the process of transformation, and openness to the unknown. It is a passage through which the individual sheds old identities and emerges renewed, ready to live from a place of greater authenticity, meaning, and purpose. The journey through the loss of motivation after spiritual awakening is not a sign of weakness or failure, but rather a profound passage through which the psyche undergoes essential transformation. It is a stripping away of old illusions, a turning inward toward the depths of the self, and a necessary death of the ego's former drives that clears the way for the emergence of a more authentic, integrated, and enduring source of motivation. Though this phase may be marked by emptiness, stillness, and uncertainty, it ultimately leads to renewal and rebirth, a return to a deeper connection with one's true nature and purpose. Embracing this process with patience and courage allows the individual to transcend previous limitations and step into a life imbued with greater meaning and wholeness. Thank you for journeying through this exploration with openness and sincerity. May you find strength in the stillness, courage in the darkness, and inspiration as you move toward the renewed motivation that arises from your deepest self. Good luck on your path of transformation and growth.